Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lynette Molyneux, and I am a researcher in climate, energy, and industry policy at the Centre for Policy Futures at this great establishment, the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. I'll be chairing the session today. Before we get underway, I'd like to add that the University of Queensland acknowledges the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet, even if virtually. Let us pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. In this session on cross-sector climate approaches in the Asia Pacific, we will hear from three researchers who have explored how identity is affected by or affects climate change impacts and solutions. First, we will hear from Isaac Dixon from the University of Queensland. Isaac is an environmental scientist with credentials in environmental management from James Cook University and the University of Queensland, and has worked in the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service. His experience with the Queensland government provided a valuable insight into the processes for incorporating scientific evidence into best practice environmental policy and regulation. He has developed a keen interest in the field of climate change adaptation, particularly for developing communities. Isaac will be speaking today on how gender mediates marine resource management, use and understanding in developing communities in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. To those who are attending the conference, if you have questions, I would suggest that you add the questions to the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will deal with those at the end of the discussion by the speakers today. So, Isaac, over to you. You have 15 minutes to discuss.
Thank you very much. Just share my screen. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much for that, Lynette. Once again, my name is Isaac Dixon, and I'm a master's student at the University of Queensland studying environmental management. Over the previous summer, I undertook a research scholarship with UQ. This involved a literature review investigating how gender mediates marine resource management use and understanding in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and the driving factors behind these patterns. I found the results of this report to be insightful and truly cross-sectoral, with the potential for significant improvements to climate adaptation planning and environmental management in the region. And so why does it matter? Once again, I believe it's morally responsible to provide assistance to marginalised groups around the world, including those who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And I believe that in many ways, women in the coastal littoral of the Pacific and Southeast Asia are sort of the vulnerable of the vulnerable. Okay, so women, especially those in developing communities, face fundamental barriers to participation in a myriad of contexts, including marine resource management. These barriers are often founded not only in deeply entrenched cultural practices and norms, but also in scientific literature, bias sampling methods, and governance representation. As such, the issues surrounding gender inequality in marine resource management presents a multifaceted challenge. So economically developing communities that reside in coastal areas will require assistance for livelihood diversification as the implications of changing climatic conditions impacts upon them. These communities are some of the most vulnerable to the effects of changing climatic conditions through impacts including rising sea level, ocean acidification, increased storm intensity, and changes in precipitation and available marine species composition. Many of these communities rely directly on the natural environment for survival, and will find it rather difficult to diversify their livelihoods independently in the face of changing climatic conditions. The climate vulnerability of coastal communities in Southeast Asia and the Pacific are further compounded by geographical and societal factors, including long coastlines, abundant low-lying areas, and a dependence upon natural resources for livelihood function and development. Gender is also a mediating factor in climate change vulnerability. Women have a higher vulnerability to the impacts of changing climatic conditions compared to men, due in part to a lack of mobility and essential training, such as the ability to swim, which results in diminished adaptive capacity. Women may face high food insecurity, high mortality rates associated with extreme events, and loss of livelihood function. So once again, in a sense, they're the vulnerable of the vulnerable. These vulnerabilities are compounded by a lack of recognition of women's role in and knowledge of marine resources for their affected communities. This results in significant gaps in socio-ecological knowledge pertaining to best practice management in the region. Finding appropriate solutions to these issues has the potential to not only improve social and economic outcomes for some of the most marginalised groups in the world, but also the potential for significant environmental improvements to fragile and ecologically significant ecosystems facing degradation. It is therefore necessary to directly address the issue of gender and marine resource management in Southeast Asia and the Pacific in order to achieve best practice natural resource management and climate adaptation planning. So once again, the three variables of how gender mediates marine resource use, understanding and management will further be evaluated with some examples in order to provide context to the scope of the issue. Okay, so use. So gender plays a key role in the habitat types that community members interact with and harvest from in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Women, especially those in the Pacific, display tendencies to engage in non-monetary activities through things such as gleaning, which involves collecting invertebrate species from within tidal, shallow or coastal areas, as well as things like seaweed and fjord collection. And these are usually for subsistence and household purposes. The natural resources that women use include marine ecosystem habitats such as seagrass areas and mangroves. These habitats provide a broad range of ecosystem services to dependent communities and are facing projected degradation from climatic forcings. Enabling productive management of these diminishing natural resources should serve as a key goal for future development planning in the area. And gender approaches will allow for improved understanding of the human role in these marine ecosystems. Men, on the other hand, are more likely to engage in commercially driven activities, such as like deep sea fin fishing and other activities, and they're more likely to interact with certain things, certain habitats such as coral reefs. This gender-mediated distinction of use is often overlooked in key pieces of policy and academic studies pertaining to marine natural resource management. Once again, this results in significant gaps in site-specific socio-ecological knowledge. Integrating this knowledge would allow for broader encompassing management practices, as well as for more accurate estimations of harvest. But it is, of course, important to mention that this pattern is not universal and should not be assumed for every system or to be unchangeable. This system of habitat use that's determined by gender, in conjunction with deeply entrenched social norms and cultural practices, results in a gender-mediated power imbalance that disproportionately impacts upon women. As a result, there exists a lack of equal economic capital building capacity, decision-making capability, and underrepresentation of women and the unique knowledge and skills that they possess in policy, governance, and scientific literature. Which leads into understanding. So gender is a mediating factor in how individuals understand marine resources and their associated ecosystem services. The value that men and women are assigned to perceived importance of ecosystem services is mediated by their use, with women placing more importance on the resources that they use and interact with, for example, such as fuelwood. Women have a deep understanding of the marine resources that they interact with, as well as a complex and dynamic relationship between the environment and society. Just as a specific example, in a 2015 study, over 93% of Fijian women interviewed expressed concerns surrounding the impacts of climate change, and 58% agreed that climate change adaptation could improve their lives, indicating a deep understanding of the major threats to their communities and possible avenues to alleviate these issues. Evidence has also shown that Fijian women are more likely to engage in mangrove restoration projects, which sort of just further compounds that understanding is mediated by the use of resources. Okay, so this leads sort of into management, which is, so gender plays a key role in the provision of marine natural resources within developing communities in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Men are more likely to be in a position of power in relation to marine resource management and decision-making in both formal and informal contexts. The scope of this problem is especially prevalent across the Pacific, which has the lowest proportion of women in formal government positions anywhere in the world. Once again, one of the most pertinent factors that influence these outcomes is women's tendency to engage in non-monetary livelihood practices, such as reproductive, subsistence, household, and sanitation duties. Despite all these duties being imperative to livelihood function, the lack of capacity to build financial capital results in a gender-orientated power matrix that disproportionately impacts upon women. Just a specific example of the scope of the problem can be found on the screen here, which is an extract from the Fisheries Act of Fiji. This act explicitly excludes women from marine resource management under Section 15 of the Native Fisheries Commission rules, which states that only a male member may be deputised for sittings of the Commission. And I found this really quite shocking that the exclusion would be so blatant, and even in a formal context such as legislation. So it's just something I found quite shocking. These barriers to participation and representation are not only evident at local and regional scales, but can also be observed in broader encompassing contexts such as academic research. Women's role in marine resource management and use in the Pacific and Southeast Asia are underrepresented in scientific literature. And to an extent, there exists a gender-biased sampling paradigm within marine resource management research in the Pacific and Southeast Asia that once again results in significant data and knowledge gaps. Just as a specific example, women were found to be underrepresented in multiple stakeholder engagement processes within existing academic literature, accounting for as low as only 6% of respondents, which is quite hard to get a full idea of a picture if you're only interviewing one group. So the opportunities for improvement from knowledge integration. So once again, women possess unique and insightful knowledge of the marine resources that they use and interact with, and implementing processes to facilitate the integration of this knowledge into policy, governance, and scientific practice is critical to appropriate and responsible environmental management and climate adaptation planning in the area. So just as some really general possible benefits that the integration could present in terms of economic, so by ensuring that all aspects of livelihood function are considered and assigned appropriate value, it will allow for more informed decision-making capacity for affected communities. Evidence suggests that diversity in decision-making creates and sustains economic growth and allows for greater perspective while limiting narrow-mindedness. In turn, this allows for the capacity to make better, more informed decisions relating to economics. Just as a side note, the ecosystem habitats that women use, most notably mangrove and seagrass habitats, have significant potential for blue carbon sequestration, among other key ecosystem services. And with the emergence of economic paradigms such as the payment for ecosystem services paradigm, this avenue of conservation could serve as one of the most pertinent for successful livelihood diversification in the future to change climatic conditions. Just some general possible environmental benefits. As already mentioned, women rely on fragile ecosystems for subsistence and livelihood functions such as mangroves, seagrass areas, and possess unique and insightful socio-ecological knowledge of these systems. Integrating the unique and valuable environmental knowledge that women possess of these natural resources into environmental management and climate adaptation planning has the potential to be one of the most pertinent avenues for conservation by just providing a full-scale spectrum of all the information that's required. By incorporating women into decision-making and management practices, policymakers and governance representatives will have a deeper understanding of the complex and dynamic relationship between local habitats and their associated ecosystem services for affected communities. And as already mentioned, diversity is recognised as one of the most influential factors that determine management outcomes and decision-making outcomes. Greater inclusion of women into formal and informal management and governance processes will ensure this trickle-down benefits for all parts of society, which includes social and cultural aspects. So just as a closing statement, the resilience of socio-ecological systems to climate change is founded upon the capacity of actors to adapt to change and the ability of actors within the systems to adjust governance and management processes in response to changing climatic conditions and environmental shocks. One of the key avenues to ensure that this is done in an appropriate and pragmatic manner is to acknowledge and integrate all functional actors, namely women, into the management process, thereby allowing for broader encompassing and improved decision-making capacity. Thank you. That's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac. That was very interesting. I think we'll move on now to the next discussion. And
sorry, Isaac, would you mind closing your
sure.
screen?
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was really interesting. So next up, we'll hear from Kevin Nute, Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Kevin is the author of Naturally Animated Architecture in 2018, This Here Now, Japanese Building and the Architecture of the Individual in 2020, and most recently, The Constructed Other, Japanese Architecture in the Western Mind, published this year. Kevin received his architectural training at the University of Nottingham before working in practices in London, Hong Kong, and Singapore. He earned his doctorate at Cambridge, has been a visiting Fulbright scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and a Japan Foundation Research Fellow at the University of Tokyo. He taught at Muraran Institute of Technology in Japan and at the University of Oregon before joining the University of Hawaii at Manoa in 2019. For today's discussion, Kevin has collaborated with Pedro Guedes, lecturer in architecture at the University of Queensland. Pedro's career has covered research and teaching at academic establishments in the UK, Australia, and for short periods in the USA, and architectural practice and cross-disciplinary collaborations with designers in other fields. Pedro is currently working at the School of Architecture with a special interest in establishing networks with colleagues in countries with different cultures and material circumstances. He seeks to facilitate connections with his contacts in Ibero-America, Southeast and South Asia, as well as Africa, where he spent his childhood in Mozambique. Pedro plans to learn about utilizing opportunism, nimble improvisation, and virtually no bureaucratic overlays to secure successful outcomes from collaboration. Kevin and Pedro will be speaking today on environmentally responsive building design as a means of sustaining climate and place identity in the Asia Pacific. So to you both, you have 15 minutes to discuss further.
Thanks, Lynette. Pedro and I agreed ahead of time that I'll take care of the presentation, but I want to make it clear that this project wouldn't have happened were it not for Pedro, who had already established a trans-Pacific network that I kind of tapped into. So it seems like it's sort of tilted towards me today, but the reality is that Pedro did all the laying of the foundations. So I'm just sort of tagging along. So just to put that into context, let me share my screen. Sorry about the sound effects, but this is what I have to live with during Zoom from home. So, okay, so the title of this talk has changed a couple of times. In fact, I changed it shortly before this evening to try to make it more accurate as to what we actually do. So there are objectives, and that's explained in the title. And then there's a method, and that kind of speaks to the network that I was just referring to that Pedro really is responsible for. So I'm going to talk about some potential design approaches, but there are just a couple. But the idea of the network is to broaden the discussion and to consider a wide range of potential local design strategies then. So I'm just going to present some that I happen to be interested in and have thought about, but they're not exclusive. And the network is a means of, as I said, widening that to come up with solutions that can be applied locally, but to have global consequences. So the objective then here is solve some problems that are local problems to do with identity and place, but because they link through the climate and local climate in particular, they obviously have global climatic consequences. So there's a misfit between architecture, contemporary architecture, and local climate that didn't exist largely in vernacular building, but does in contemporary building because it's been covered with a largely Western, largely modern kind of canvas that ignores local largely. Pedro would take issue with that, that there are examples of modern buildings that are responsive, but the majority are universalist. They don't take account of their locality well. So the Pacific Ocean, as many people listening will know, it has many climates, huge variation at any given moment. And then when you add in over time, it's not one place at all. It has multiple climates. Rainfall, likewise, any given moment, massive gradients of precipitation, and then you put in month to month, and that switches around. And yet, when we look at contemporary cities across Asia, I couldn't tell you, when I put these slides together, which one of these is which. I would have to find some, one-off iconic buildings to be able to say, oh yeah, that's Seoul, only because, they've got that one unique tower. But if you look at the normal building types, office buildings and apartment buildings, you can't tell, and I can't tell. And yet, so when you fly into those places and you start listening to the language and smelling the food, you realize, oh yeah, I'm in Tokyo and I'm not in Taipei, but you wouldn't know from the architecture. So there's been a massive loss of place, and that's a loss of identity, right? Place identity, through the process of Western modernization in the Pacific has equated to Westernization, right? And that's really what this project is attempting to address. Is it possible to arrest that loss of place, the gradual, not so gradual, rapid homogenization of cities across the globe, but particularly in the Pacific, because a lot of these cities have developed in the last 50, 60 years since the war. And if so, how would you go about doing that, given that we live in the sort of socioeconomic system that we do? Without changing that, how could you possibly have any impact on this homogenization of the built environments? So it's to address these issues then, loss of place and identity, and the misfit between contemporary buildings that just run AC instead of adapting to local climate, huge wasted energy and therefore unnecessary greenhouse emissions because of that misfit. Just turn on the AC, leave the lights on, that obviously has massive consequences because it's repeated everywhere. And all the wasted natural resources that get shipped across the world, again, generating greenhouse gases, etc., when they could have been resourced locally, but the system's not set up to do that. So the objective is to identify strategies for using local characteristics to reduce the wastage and also hopefully increase the identity, the recognizability of contemporary built environments. So the strategies that I'm going to talk about, and they're not exhaustive, are the built integration of local landscape features, climatic features and cultural features. And I'm cheating somewhat because I'm going to compress climate and culture into one, and I'll explain why. So some examples then, some historical, some from Asia, some not, misspelling of integration, sorry, that's embarrassing, but integrating features of local landscape. So we can go back to the 16th century and the borrowing of features outside of this garden then. The pagoda is a long way outside of the boundaries. So you may have heard the notion of borrowed landscape from Japan, but it originates like so much. It originally comes from China. And so this is what I mean by integrating local landscape features. And they don't have to be traditional. They can be a mountain. They can be a building. There are landmarks around every city that, when you wake up in a generic hotel room, that you can recognize, oh yeah, I'm there because I can see such and such a mountain or whatever view, it might be a building. So then when that gets transferred into 18th century Japan, this example is from Kyoto. This is the temple of Entsuchi, the temple garden. And that mountain, Mount Hiei, is the other side of Kyoto. The entire modern city of Kyoto is between us and the mountain, but it's carefully edited out so that it becomes part of the garden. Another example, Shodenji in Kyoto, same mountain, somewhat further away, but I think you get the picture, right? So this is a way of integrating place, locality, right, into architecture. And there's no reason why that can't be done today. Here I am on the 6th floor of a hotel, modern hotel in Kyoto, and they've carefully concealed all the hideous modern buildings between us and the mountain. And as long as you're sitting down, as soon as you stand up, the game is up. You can see the tops of the high-rise buildings, but it's possible to do this, right? To integrate buildings seamlessly, right? I call this splicing, basically, where the background and the foreground have been directly spliced together, and the middle ground has all been concealed. More mundanely, but this is done, you know, we've all heard of infinity pools. I think this was taken, I took the photograph. This is taken on the 15th floor of the Shimoda Hotel. You know, that's the Pacific, the top body of the water, but the near body of water is a large public bath on the 15th floor. And that island then becomes part of, you know, this experience of taking the bath. So it's possible to do this. It's been done traditionally, and it's one way of integrating place. So here's a modern Japanese architect doing the same thing. And just to bring it home a little bit, or at least for us, for me, Frank Lloyd Wright was not averse to this, right? His buildings are embedded in place. And one way is to take a part of that place and frame it architecturally. So the building is rooted in that location. You know where you are. So I talked about climate and culture and compressing the two. And this book from 1969 had a huge influence, Amos Rappaport. And I kind of want to critique this in a sense that it sets up house form and culture in a dichotomy. Well, what is house form if it's not culture? That's material culture. It's, you know, it's a bit tough because 1969, you know, is a different world, of course, right? But I believed for a very long time, yeah, the thing that really forms house form is not climate, right? Which was very popular kind of myth that it was climate driven. It's really what makes for a good life, which is culturally driven. But it's a false separation. And I realized this only fairly recently reading this book by Japanese author that predates, it's sort of pre-war, late 20s. Philosopher. And he argued fairly convincingly that climate is a fundamental molder of culture. You can't set that apart. Think about it, right? Let's look at the Japanese culture, for example. What you wear, what you eat, what you need to keep warm, you know, where, how, and you sleep, they're all, and these are just the Japanese climate, which happens to be rather complicated. It's very cold and very hot, right? Rather unusual, right? And they've had to adapt their culture, what they wear, what they eat, to those two extremes, right? And so if you go back far enough, the beginnings of any culture are climatically driven, right? It's survival. You eat what's available, you wear what will keep you cool enough or hot, warm enough to survive, right? So to separate climate from culture, right? I'm not saying that they're completely driven, but they are in at the ground floor. If we go back far enough, right? Climate dictates what we wear, what we eat, you know, how we shelter ourselves originally. And we are a long way from that now, of course, but still, we still eat the same traditional foods. Sometimes we wear the same clothing. So that stuff is ingrained. So again, sorry about the spelling of integrating, but how would you integrate local climate? This is a famous example from a famous book called Architecture Without Architects, Bernard Rudowski's book from the 60s. It was an exhibition, but these, I've never been to Sind, and I'm sure that, that it doesn't look quite the same, but these are all wind catchers. They're all oriented to pick up the cooling winds. And the reason that they look like trapezoids is because the wind, the prevailing winds come from at an angle to the grid of the city. So they're actually square apertures, but they look like they're trapezoid because they're rotated relative to the angle of the building, the street grid did. So, and they come down, that air is passed over water, and that has a passive cooling effect on the interior, very important one. Here is Charles Correa in Mumbai in 1970, demonstrating that a global modern building type, the high-rise apartment building, you can do the same thing, right? You don't need, as they do here, right, to turn on the air conditioning and pay the electric bill and pay the environmental price for doing that. It's perfectly possible. Massive waste across the globe, especially in this part of the world, in North America, right, where they're addicted to AC. I haven't used AC in a year that I've been in Hawaii. You don't need to, it's not necessary. And here's the cross section, and you can see large apertures, right, to get cross ventilation through. Not difficult at all. And it doesn't look massively different, right? But in terms of livability, completely different environment. All because of the wind and the orientation, clever location of apertures, basically. A more contemporary example in Vietnam, it's perfectly possible if you look at the, it's kind of a building within a building, but you get these wonderful interstitial spaces where there's planting, and the air is free to flow through this, but you've got privacy, you know, perfectly possible. So I'll let this play a little bit, but this is the book that Lynette mentioned, and I won't go through the whole thing, but it's really about bringing natural change into buildings. But there's an overlap with that natural change and passive environmental control strategies, basically cooling, solar heating, shading, evaporative cooling, etc. So it's a win-win thing that you can improve psychologically what it's like to be inside buildings that are often, unfortunately, static. But you can also draw attention, and I'll come out of that. You can draw attention to these kinds of strategies by making them active. The problem with passive strategies is they're so passive that nobody knows that they're actually working even when they are. And architecture does a very poor job. They put up plaques of LEED, platinum plaques that even most architects don't know, well, why did it get that gold star? And most non-architects, no clue at all, right? So architecture, buildings are doing a very poor job of teaching when everybody, most people live in a building, work in a building, right? Massive opportunity. There's a captive audience, right, for that building to say something way beyond just the people who use that building, and they don't do that. So I'm on a bit of a campaign to make buildings speak, not literally, but to do a better job of, they can walk the walk, but they don't talk the talk. They don't demonstrate what they're actually doing, right? So that's part of my agenda. But this network, the one that Pedro has helped me to start, and again, he has a much bigger network, right? But these are people that I've invited just to my Asia Pacific architecture class. And it was a happy coincidence of Zoom, unfortunate because of the COVID crisis, but Zoom enabled me to include all of these people across the Pacific, including Chile. Most of these, more than half, are Pedro's contacts. And it's been an eye-opener that I'm able to introduce live, you know, bring these people into my class and expose my students. And the idea is to consult them. They're based in all of these cities, right, across, you know, so you can see I'm kind of like CEO, I suppose, because I'm in the middle. That's the only reason. But these are the two main objectives: taking global building types like commercial office buildings and apartment buildings, and see if they can't be adapted to local circumstances so that they become recognizably local, but also retrofitting. That's a huge missed opportunity because our building stock is not going to go anywhere. We're stuck. There's too much invested in our current buildings that are terribly inefficient. So the current Pritzker Prize winners from France made their career on retrofitting, right? And that's going to be the future, is to take our dinosaur buildings and make them work in local climatic conditions. And hopefully they'll look different if they're done in Taipei or Santiago. They're probably going to look different because the climates are so different. So thank you for listening. I hope I haven't gone too far over time.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Kevin. Pedro, do you have anything to add before we go into the questions on you need to unmute.
I very much enjoyed playing with Kevin with this crowd of people, because I think one of the great opportunities that this interruption of travel and all that kind of thing has given us, it's given us familiarity with a whole lot of ways of getting together with people in lots of other places very, very easily. And another important thing is that it's actually eliminated the gradient of cost, because somebody in Bangladesh can talk to somebody in Hawaii, somebody in Cambodia can talk to somebody in Australia, and it doesn't consume very much electricity, and it's a great thing. And I think that this is actually one of the futures of education, the ability to bring people together. I mean, I fell into Kevin's classroom, and it was great fun. I kind of overstayed my welcome, but I spoke to his students, and we had a great time together. And I've done similar things with people in South America, people in lots of other countries. It's a really valuable thing to do, and I think universities have to rise up to do this kind of thing, because there are people who are hungry for these events all over the world. I think that's just about all I have to say about this, but I did really enjoy working with Kevin on this, and we see a future in continuing to do these things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pedro. And now, moving on to some questions. We have a few that have arrived. To Isaac, the question is how is it that you think the gaps in the policy settings have actually arisen? How did that happen in the policy making that was the structure behind the difference in the gender gaps that actually arose? How's that happened, do you think?
I think one of the biggest influencing factors is, as I mentioned, that governance representatives, especially in the Pacific, are mostly men. And many of and as mentioned in the policy, men are sort of assumed to be the only ones that have the capacity to manage. So I think it's really a result of really deeply entrenched social norms and cultural practices that's just reflected in policy. So yeah, I think the policy sort of just exacerbates how big the problem is.
And did you work with women in this, in collecting the data?
No, I did this during COVID, so I wasn't actually able to travel anywhere to do it. So mine was just purely a literature review. And yeah, I just made comments about the patterns that I found within the existing literature.
Cool, thank you. To Kevin. So what are the effective collaboration for cross-section sectors in climate change? I guess this goes to both you and to Pedro. So collaboration is the answer, but how do we actually make it effective to go across the whole sort of the sectors that are climate change? And the area that I work in, you know, much of it actually goes from one sector to multiple other sectors. And how do those collaborations really deal with the fact that they have to be across so many different sectors?
Yeah, it is a really good question, and I'm gonna give a not good answer to it. I'm becoming increasingly aware that, and it's embarrassing, I suppose, in the sense that architects are always having to work with other disciplines. We can't work on our own, and yet in education, you know, the education of architects, we do a very poor job of exposing our students to other professionals. You know, they sadly often get taught that they're going to be a one-off star architect, right? And the reality is they're going to be working in a team, and they're going to be working with a client team with a whole host of professionals, more so now than ever. And so I don't have a good answer, but I do, for me, it's like, oh, you know, on my to-do list, in the sense of it didn't ought to be. Right now, almost everyone on that screen is an architect or an educator or both. And it ought to be filled with policymakers and all the other good people, Lynette. So, you know, we could quadruple that at least. You know, who are the stakeholders? Developers, right? None of this is going to move in a capitalist system, right? The reason that it all is homogenous is because a Western capitalist system, commercially based, you know, and that's what the outcome is. So unless we change that system, and I'm not proposing that we do, I'm not saying it's good or by no means perfect, but I, you know, I know about architecture, I don't know about politics. So how, you know, we know what drives that system. And I don't know, and most architects don't know why, what are the commercial factors that make those buildings look so homogeneous. And I'm embarrassingly ignorant. Pedro could talk to you about that probably. I don't want to put him under the bus here, and most architects are very ignorant of that, sometimes deliberately, because it's kind of boring, it's economics, and that's the stuff that drives all of this, of course. You know, it's the owners of those office buildings, and it's the people who live in those apartments. You know, they make decisions, and understanding why it's fine to talk about what people should do, and then I'm sure Isaac could, you know, talk about this too. You know, there's the realities of the systems that we're working in, right? So there's the obvious, you know, you do this to solve that problem, but then you realize, oh, it's other social and other factors are getting in the way, and I'm sure that's true. You know, that there are issues, not necessarily the same ones, but some of the same kind of social issues to do with who's actually funding these projects, you know, who builds buildings, who builds these commercial buildings, etc. And I and many other architecturally trained people don't get taught, you know, who are the other stakeholders. So the conclusion would be that network needs to be a lot more heterogeneous, you know, not just a bunch of architects talking to each other, you know. Pedro, did I do a really bad job there? Can you correct me?
No, I think you're doing well. I think the issue is cross-disciplinarity. I think there has to be a lot of curiosity about what other people can bring to something, and that I think one of the things about the Asia Pacific area is that there are examples in it of very many different societies that have different ways of structuring these communications across things. I mean, I was just on the issue of buildings and development, breaking the mold of this Eurocentric modernism that's been around for almost 3/4 of a century, is in Singapore. I mean, because it's a city-state and a very small place with lots of people, they've actually jettisoned some of the ideas that were accepted by developers and architects and planners, which was to do with zoning cities. They were experimenting with having these things called hubs, where you have many multifunctions going together so that they can actually use the same infrastructure at different times of the day or the year. And in order to make these things possible, they've had to have people coming together, not only designers. The designers are kind of quite low on the food chain. The people who are really important are the programmers, the people who decide on what ingredients are likely to make a good mix. And they actually come up with some fairly interesting developments. The architecture is not necessarily all that great, but they do have a dynamic to them, which many of the cities in the Asia Pacific actually lack because of things like zoning. And I think one actually has to recognize that there are some things that we've taken as accepted wisdom that have actually made enormous damage to the environments that have been produced in the last 75 years, which is the time, you know, when all these things have become massively rampant.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add a quick little insight into that, because in the energy world, we have a similar problem. Everything is designed by engineers. and costed by economists, and ultimately you provide a service to a bunch of users, and we very seldom ask those users actually what they want. And I guess the same sort of analogy can be drawn with this restructure or let's say modernization or westernization of architecture across the board, is that it was designed probably with some investor or some developer or somebody's idea of what a building should be like, but often were the people who would stay in that or live in it or work in it asked exactly what they would like in terms of an outcome. And
top down, very much so. And
always
that
top down.
That intersects with Isaac. If you're dealing with a structure that was decided by a bunch of guys, guess what? You're not going to get a fair shake. I don't want to dominate all the question time. I think there are some questions for Isaac too. So
yes, I'm going to move on to that now. Isaac, I have a question here, which is what prompted you to get into this topic?
During my research scholarship, I was working with a professor from UQ, and she was working on a fellowship that was about ties with the Australian and Asia Pacific communities and about aid. So that was really what motivated me to get into it. I did sort of a systematic review to aid in the fellowship, which sort of went forward to the federal government to aid in their aid program for the Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Yeah.
So I guess just also a sort of associated question is that I don't know, but I assume that most of the women in these communities also have the child rearing skills or the
yes, exactly, yeah.
So the gender becomes even more the family really, because it's the children and the family home and everything else. It actually it's more than just a male-female thing. It's actually the whole family, which is excluded from much of the policy requirements for the whole group.
That's right, yeah. Men sort of really have the upper hand in those communities in a lot of contexts. And just sort of another side note, if we're attempting to make fundamental change to communities in the face of changing climatic conditions, one of the biggest ways you're going to have to do that is intergenerationally. And as you mentioned, women play the major role in raising children in a lot of these communities. So if we want to make fundamental intergenerational change, it's actually sort of pragmatic that we involve women even more, because then they'll be able to pass on their knowledge and the knowledge they've acquired to their children so the next generation will be better placed in the future.
Yeah, that's very true. So do you think, Isaac, that with COVID restrictions, maybe on the sort of, if we could remove the COVID restrictions, that there is a valuable piece of research to be done to actually go to the Pacific Islands that you've been in and actually have that one-on-one engagement with the woman and perhaps try to find ways for shifting the focus away from male dominance in the policy making to women getting engaged as well?
I think definitely. I think, across multiple different scales, there's possible environmental benefits, there's possible economic benefits. I've really only scratched the surface of this. The evidence suggests that some people believe that women's socio-ecological knowledge is an untapped resource and something that will be useful in the future, especially with climate change. So I really believe that it's an important issue and something that really needs to be acknowledged and integrated into future planning in the area.
Yes, I think you can assume that most women would think that there's an untapped resource in there.
Yeah.
Last question to you, Isaac. Do you think that women's roles in collection activities that you mentioned give them a particular insight into climate change and climate change solutions? Do you think there's a specific climate change lens that women can actually bring to bear on policy options?
I think since they're sort of on the front line of a lot of the climate change happening, especially maybe women from older generations who've seen and acknowledged the deterioration of the resources that they interact with over the last several decades. I think that information would be really, really valuable because in a lot of these communities, there isn't data from a long time ago because they've sort of only recently been investigated by scientists. So I think that would definitely be one avenue of maybe sort of mapping out a little bit better how climate has changed over the last so long. And I think women obviously will be, since they're interacting with these really vulnerable ecosystems, that if we were to integrate them into the management process, then that would really provide sort of a pragmatic way to put a focus on these habitats and allow them to get the attention that they require.
Yeah, and just a little thing there. Do you think there's a way that utilizing memories as sort of the original form of data can actually allow you to tap those memories to gain the data to be able to do the subsequent research is a potential?
Yeah, it's a potential. That was actually part of my report as well, was local observations of environmental degradation. And like I said, where there is a lack of hard data over previous decades, then that's sort of really the best that there is. And in many cases, it's a valuable resource. I came across a lot of quotes from women throughout my research that were discussing about how, they used to see this many species in this area, and then now there's only so many. They used to be able to harvest, X amount, and now they're only being able to harvest half of that amount. So yeah, I believe it is a really valuable resource that should be integrated into the planning for the area.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Back to Kevin and Pedro. Do you think that design could be used as a means for resource management? So Isaac presented that women's knowledge wasn't being recognized, but is there a way to incorporate that into the architectural side as well?
I think so. And I think one of the issues, which I think carries on from Isaac's contribution, is that one of the things that is a problem with this change that we are all going to have to make in the next 20, 30 years is the way we value knowledge. I mean, a lot of Western knowledge is the stuff that has priority is things that can be reduced to numbers, and things that fall outside the kind of the umbrella of numbers get put aside. And I think that one actually needs to be curious about a lot of things that can't be trapped in statistics, in numbers, and all that kind of thing, and actually find ways of being reassured by other kinds of information, data, and knowledge, and be open to that. And I think that is something that I think we can all learn from each other in the Asia Pacific, because the populations around our body of water actually have many, many different experiences. Kevin, do you have any?
Yeah, I read the question. I really appreciate what you just said, Pedro. My response was more mundane, I suppose. That yes, I read it in terms of. I'll give you an example. 90% of resources in the state of Hawaii are imported. Food resources, building construction materials, all the concrete, everything is brought in, and so resourcing locally, that's another issue. But I'm talking to a group now who are hoping to start planting bamboo commercially, because it apparently sequesters 10 times the amount of a coniferous tree, right? And this would be a great climate. And with the technology we've got, it can be a structural timber. You can build high-rise buildings with cross-laminated timber, including bamboo these days. So those kinds of local resourcing, right? We're not going to go back to the Stone Age and live in one-story buildings. We can't do that. But resourcing locally and not wasting huge resources, moving stuff around the globe and damaging the climate, in the process is important. And I think there was a gender component of that, a originally, I think I was reading Isaac's question, and I wasn't necessarily able to, there's no doubt that that in the same way, Isaac identified, climate almost as a sort of canary in the coal mine, and he said the most vulnerable, and probably the most sensitive, the people who are at the end of, who are noticing, the birds don't come like they used to, and I can't get as much fruit as I used to be able to, They are going to notice, so I really appreciate that. And I'm sure when it comes to, there are 100 words in Hawaiian for winds, specific winds. You only name a wind when it's really important to your survival, right? There's a rain, there's a wind that bears rain where you don't want to be, planting at that time, perhaps, or harvesting, right? And all of that has been kind of lost because you can just flatten it. So the most sensitive people in societies, and they are unfortunately, disproportionately women, have been, right? That's changing, but not quickly. Are going to be the people that, are probably most, and young, I think the young generally, anyone under the age of about 8, is a critical kind of audience because they haven't been, stuffed full of the ideas that create the kind of built environments that we're not too happy with, right? So a lot of the stuff that I've been interested in, we all would have experienced before we were 5, right? And so I'm not sure if I'm answering that question, but I think that generation of whatever gender, the next generation, I'm interested now in K-12 education, and especially the K part of it, right? How can you introduce these things and make those children super sensitive to their climate and resources? And it starts with the climate. There's a lot of talk about biophilia, which annoys me. I mean, nothing against A. Wilson, but there's nothing green without the weather, without this wonderful blanket of atmosphere, which last time I checked, there's exactly 0 other planets with an atmosphere like this. So for me, educating the next generation about how special this blanket is that makes this planet blue really early, so that they're not going to dream of, throwing out stuff that could be recycled or turning on the AC without thinking about the consequences. And I think there's only so many documentaries that you can watch of starving polar bears before you switch off and say, this is just too depressing. Like, what can I do about it, right? So the approach that I, at least, have been taking is to say, well, why, sure, there's a place for that, and there's a place for climate. Of course there is, but there's also another approach is to say, this stuff's beautiful. And it ends up with a very serious conversation, but, it starts with, wow, that's beautiful. What is that? Let's value, it's another approach. And I think there's room for that because it's been, I'm not trashing the other approaches by any means, right? But I think, we're wired differently. Some of us respond to the numbers, right? And you look at the graphs and go, wow, this is a massive problem. And some of us perhaps would say, this is beautiful. And now you're telling me that it might just go away. Wow, what can I do about that? So I think from that point of view, I think it's the young, I wouldn't split it gender-wise, but who are more sensitive, right? We all were, right? And then we could get beaten by the, travails of life. And so I'm very keen in getting this into early education, literally into the classroom. So whether they become a doctor or a dentist or an accountant, they're kind of sensitized to this stuff. But that's kind of my personal agenda, and I'm not dragging Pedro into that necessarily, but that would be my response to resource management. And to me, I don't know, the word resource, is the atmosphere a resource? It's that whole relationship. And the reason that buildings are so important and cities is because they're the biggest cultural thing that we make, right? And they represent physically our interface with nature, right? You can actually see it. And my interface is no interface. Nature just comes in here. The birds literally walk through my apartment, right? That's not always good, but this notion of there's an outside and it's not my responsibility, and there's the inside, and that is, you know, buildings can send all kinds of messages, and some of them are completely wrong, that stuff out there is not my problem. Well, we're finding out that it is, you know, it will eventually become, it is already our problem, right? Sorry for the long speech, but yeah, I don't know if I answered the question. I answered several questions, but none of the ones that were actually asked. So
Thank you so much to all three of you. It's been a really interesting discussion for me, although, you know, kind of like as I'm not in this field in particular, but I found it absolutely fascinating. And thank you all to your time and your really interesting presentations. And I'm sorry we've run out of time. I'm sure we could keep going if we kind of had the opportunity, but thanks to the organizers and thanks to our participants who've joined us. And I hope that you found it as interesting as I have, and go well and design into the future to take account of the changes we have to all consider for the future.